Once again, welcome everyone. Welcome to this webinar. My name is Kuthum Mutsumi. I'm a gender and climate change expert at the International Institute of Sustainable Development. I'm also a climate change negotiator for the government of Botswana, where I'm from. And I also negotiate for the African group of negotiators, particularly on climate adaptation. And I'm delighted and honored to moderate this session today. And once again, welcome. And thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedule to come and participate at this event. Today's event is entitled Gender Equality Action for Climate Resilient Food Systems, Parliamentarians' Perspective. This is the 6th virtual dialogue from the series of the Parliamentarians Action for Gender Equality and Resilient Food Systems in response to COVID-19. As you can see, these dialogues were organized as parliamentarians' response to COVID-19 since the start of COVID 2020. And the previous dialogues have been focused on matters related to the topic of gender equality and resilient food systems. And it covered topics such as gender and land rights, gender and family farming, financing, and youth. These dialogues are organized in the framework of the ECOWAS network of parliamentarians on gender and agriculture investment and food security. And it is supported by FAO, ISD, Oxfam, and WildF. It is these organizations that I've just mentioned that have made this event possible. And I would just like to acknowledge that from the very beginning and thank the organizations for being part of this. Now we move to the theme of today, which is climate change and gender and food systems. The year 2021 is a milestone year for food systems and for climate action. Earlier in the year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the IPCC, released the findings of the 6th assessment report, which predicts that the world will reach 1.5 degree warming in 2 decades, which is much sooner than we had anticipated. Unless, of course, global emissions are reduced and are cut by half in the coming decade. This is doable, but it will take the world to act fast and to act swiftly. But even without the cutting of the current emissions, temperatures have already increased globally. And in some African countries, like the country I'm from, the temperatures have increased by more than 1 degree Celsius. This increasing temperature is a major threat to our food systems, undermining decades of progress in providing some nutritious diets to a growing global population. The different gender roles, as well as the different access to and control over resources, agency, and opportunities in society influence the vulnerability of men and women to climate change and their responses to its impacts, as well as their ability to build resilient food systems for their households and communities. It is therefore important that the response to climate stresses on food systems take into account gender-based constraints and create opportunities to tap into the potential of women and youth as agents of change and resilience building. The just ended Food Systems Summit and the upcoming climate conference, COP26, are an important global platform which could produce mutually reinforcing commitments of action at the intersection of climate, food systems, and gender. Now, why parliamentarians? Parliamentarians play a fundamental role in providing and enabling environment and strong political will to deal with the nexus of climate, food systems, and gender. They have an oversight role on how governments respond, and including budget allocation of how governments do budgets. It is in this context that we are hosting this 6th webinar with a particular focus on the functions of parliamentarians, which include law and policy making that address climate change and consider gender and other social inequalities. This webinar will allow the sharing of successful experiences, but also challenges and lessons from the region on how international and national policies and legal frameworks address gender, climate change, and the agriculture nexus. It will also allow us to understand how in some countries, gender inclusion and climate change policies have improved the effectiveness and efficiency of climate action. Today, I'm delighted to have these prominent speakers for the next 2 hours who will share those experiences from the region. For the opening session, I am honored to present to you 2 speakers. The first speaker I have the honor to introduce Mr. Senko Sangar, the ECOWAS Commissioner of Agriculture, Environment and Water Resources. Mr. Sangor is an agronomist by training and is specialized in management of agriculture enterprises and projects. Before joining the ECOWAS, Mr. Sangor held high administrative positions in his country, which is the Republic of Guinea, including as advisor to the President of the Republic, Professor Alpha Conde, and Secretary General of the Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock. Since 2018, is the Commissioner for the Department of Agriculture and Environment and Water Resources of ECOWAS. Unfortunately, Mr. Sangor will not be able to join us today due to the commitments. And so Mr. Ernest Obe, who is the head of Agriculture Division at the ECOWAS Commission in Abuja, will read the Commissioner's speech. Mr. Ernest Obe, you have the floor to present the welcome remarks from the Commissioner. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. I am reading on behalf of Commissioner Sangare, who is unavoidably absent because he is on international official mission at this point in time. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed a singular honor and pleasure for me to deliver the welcome statement at the Parliamentarian Action number 6 with the title Gender Equality Action for Climate Resilience Food System, Parliamentarians' Perspective. I want to take this opportunity to commend the International Institute for Sustainable Development and the ECOWAS Network of Parliamentarians on Gender and Investments in Agriculture and Food Security for the different webinar series that seeks to address contemporary agriculture issues and provide sustainable solutions to the transformation of agriculture in West Africa. The issue of resilient food system was at the heart of the recently concluded Food System Summit held at the United Nations last week. In the discourse of food systems on the African continent, the focus tends to be on the various shocks that our people endure, such as environmental, economic, social, and political shocks. In the discussions, we tend to overlook the gender dimension to the development of climate-resilient food systems. Gender is at the center of any climate-resilient food system. It is in this regard that we are encouraged by the International Institute for Sustainable Development for taking up this initiative of organizing this webinar. Distinguished participants, the need for us to mainstream gender equality in the development of climate-resilient food systems is critical in the transformation of West African agriculture. Women, youths, the poor, and other marginalized groups constitute the majority of our agricultural population and tend to suffer most the negative consequences of climate change in our member states. Gender equality is therefore a fundamental right of all citizens, especially our farmers who are the producers of our common agricultural wealth. Distinguished participants, by neglecting the interests of women and other disadvantaged groups, we are neglecting the most productive section of our workforce. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, if women farmers are given the same access to resources as men, 2.5 to 4%, and the number of malnourished people could be reduced by 12 to 17%. As a region, we must take accelerated action on climate change, and we must address the issues of gender inequality and related gaps. In my humble opinion, we need to pay particular attention to the following fundamental issues: One, policies and laws impeding women's participation in agricultural transformation needs to be reviewed and reversed at all levels of state. Adverse effects of climate change on women and marginalized groups should go beyond the broad-based climate mitigation and adaptation strategies, but should include tailor-made interventions that will empower women to be active actors in the agricultural value chains of our member states. Number three, funding approach should support transformative efforts that are more inclusive of people, in particular women smallholder farmers. In most countries, the stringent collateral requirements does not provide access to credit for our women farmers. Access to production resources such as land, water, and technology are crucial in the building of climate resilient food systems. Diverse gender-based barriers render women vulnerable to food insecurity in West Africa. The challenges facing women are more than what I have elaborated above. At the level of the ECOWAS Commission, we are mindful of the importance of women in ensuring that we achieve the goal of food security and sovereignty as outlined in the ECOWAS Agricultural Policy 2025. In this regard, the ECOWAS Commission have developed programs that respond to the challenge of women, youths, and other marginalized groups. These include a resilience program, an ecological agriculture transformation program, youth and agriculture development program, fisheries governance, climate smart and nutrition sensitive interventions. All these interventions cater for the active participation of women in the development of a resilient food system in the ECOWAS region. The building of such a system calls for collective action by the governments and peoples of the region. The role of the regional, national, and state parliamentarians cannot be overemphasized. Parliamentarians, as representatives of the people, have a sacred duty to advocate for increased investment in the agricultural sector at all levels. The Maputo and Malabo declarations within the CADEP framework must be respected and implemented by our member states. Investments in agriculture must go beyond the payments of salaries of public servants. We must invest in technology, invest in improvements of value chains, and also in rural infrastructure that will benefit women and other marginalized groups. Basic social services, such as health, education, water, and sanitation requires urgent attention by our parliamentarians. As parliamentarians, I appeal to all of you to ensure relevant laws are in place for the building of climate resilience food system in West Africa. You should work with all other actors, including the public and private sector, to build a healthier and more nutritious food system in all the 15 ECOWAS member states. This is more urgent as we deal with the COVID-19 pandemic in our respective countries. In conclusion, the ECOWAS Commission will continue to support the ECOWAS member states and work with our parliamentarians to build a climate resilient food system in which gender equality, participation, ownership, and subsidiarity are the building blocks for an ECOWAS of people that are food and nutrition secure. I also want to take this opportunity to welcome all of you to this very important webinar, and we look forward to the outcomes of this webinar for further action at the level of ECOWAS Commission and at the level of all our stakeholders in the member states. I wish you all a successful deliberation. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ernest Ube, and thank you for reading the statement from Mr. Senghor, the commissioner. Please pass our regards to him. We're very grateful that you could read and participate in this event. And thank you for highlighting some of the commitments that the ECOWAS as a region is making, and making that connection to food systems, which is just what has completed right now that was led by the UN Secretary General. So thank you for highlighting that and the commitments that you have raised. I will now hand over the floor and firstly introduce our next speaker, which is Mr. Zituni Odada. He is the Deputy Director, Climate and Environment Division, FAO. Before joining FAO, he worked as Head of Technology Unit at UNEP for 5 years. Prior to that, he worked for the British government for 15 years at the Department of Energy and Climate Change. And before that, he worked for the French government on international climate change during the French presidency of the European Union in 2008. So we can see Mr. Zituni has a wealth of experience in the area of climate change from different perspectives. And he's also the Deputy Director of Climate and Environment Division, FAO. Mr. Zituni, I have the honor to give you the floor to give the keynote address for the webinar. You have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Kulthum, and welcome everyone to this event. It's my pleasure to join you live. And I would like to acknowledge the collaboration with ECOWAS, IASD, and Oxfam in providing this space and this opportunity for parliamentarians to discuss this important topic on gender equality and resilient food systems in response to COVID-19, and particularly in focusing on the nexus of climate change, food systems, and gender equality. We just come out of the UN Food Systems Summit, where gender will also address as an important aspect and an important and critical issue to be addressed. And we're heading towards COP26. And as we know, gender equality has been on agenda for a number of years, and it's an issue that is at the heart of delivering both the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. I think we are at a time that everyone understands that there is increasing evidence that shows how climate change affects us in different ways, men and women, and how often women in particular are more vulnerable to the impact of climate change. And the major gender differentiated impacts that have been shown from climate change, particularly in rural areas, they show a number of facts. First, that the greater food and nutrition insecurity is affecting women in particular. The increased knowledge, or the increased really workload that women and girls are undertaking in rural areas, particularly in collecting water and firewood, which is related to the impact that they undergo from climate change. And also the fact that the ownership to land, and this was mentioned by Mr. Obe, access to land, water, and technology, women have a limited access to land ownership. And the other point is on the different impact of disasters and migration that affects women more than men. And obviously, since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, additional stresses were then imposed on people, and more probably on women than men. So women play a key role when we look at the food systems. They play a key role in producing, processing, and also trading food and agricultural products. And as I said earlier, the COVID-19 pandemic has affected their activities in these areas, affected it really seriously. Because today, we have around 811 million people who are going hungry. But COVID-19 could add up to 132 million additional people who would be experiencing food insecurity as a direct result of the pandemic. And around 2/3 of this are actually from low-income countries, and women are more likely to be affected. And since we talk today in the context of transforming our agri-food systems to make them more productive, more resilient, and more inclusive, so the question here obviously is, how can we possibly achieve this transformation of agri-food systems without transformation that includes everyone? And gender equality has the transformative and multiplier effect that we really desperately need. And that means that to achieve gender equality, we need to transform, we need transformative change in the gender issue, because we've been talking about it for a while, but it's a time really to show that there is significant change in the gender equality. And this can be achieved only really through empowerment. So we have to get women into power and decision-making positions. So let me give you some examples. Based on our experience in supporting countries with their national adaptation plans and national determined contributions, here's what we found. So gender equality is not sufficiently integrated into these, unfortunately, into the NAPs and the NDCs that I mentioned. And this has to be done at the design stage, really from the start, and not really towards the end. From the start, it has to be included throughout the process. And also there is a need to strengthen the national capacities and capabilities to design and implement gender responsive and gender transformative interventions. So we must invest also in the leadership and negotiation skills of women and youth, excuse me, so that they can equally participate in international and national debates, including what we mentioned, the Food Systems Summit and the upcoming COP26. And for achieving gender transformation for women in agriculture, let me give you another example where we want to make sure that gender balanced participation is happening in the climate change negotiations at COP26 and beyond. And here I just want to mention a training that we have been doing for female agriculture experts, who will go on to proudly represent their countries at the next COP26 in Glasgow. And this is really critical because women need to be, as I said earlier, at the table, at the decision-making process, so they can voice their experience, they can influence the process going forward. And if we look more broadly on why it is important to empower women, let's look at the example of empowering mothers to enhance girls' education. So educated mothers are more than twice as likely to send their children to school. So globally, 65 million girls are not in school. So educating a girl can break the cycles of poverty and hunger and resilience to climate change that we're talking about. And as it was mentioned by Obe before, obviously access to technology and mobile phones is critical. In some cultures, we know, unfortunately, women are not allowed to own mobile phones. So we also need some gender targets. As I said earlier, we've been talking about this topic for a while, and we need some concrete results, some visible concrete results. So setting targets of what we want to achieve within the gender agenda by when, and be transparent about it, would be really helpful. So in FAO, as many colleagues know, we've been supporting countries by mainstreaming gender into climate policy and action plans through a series of activities and projects, including the ones I mentioned earlier, NAPs and NDCs, but also through the Coronivia Joint Work on Agriculture, the NDC Partnership, the Climate Smart Agriculture and the Global Alliance for Climate Smart Agriculture, GEF and GCF projects, and also our collaboration with some key partners such as the World Bank, IFAD, CGR, CARE, and others, to make sure that we do have some consistent development of gender responsive climate smart technologies, methodologies, and practices. So just to finish, I think there is a major gap that we still have to be able to design and implement policies, legal frameworks, and investment that address this nexus between gender equality, climate change, and agriculture. And I really hope that this event today, with the presence of parliamentarians, will really help address this gap going forward. And I would like to offer my full support to the time and engagement given by parliamentarians and decision makers really in this agenda, so we can overcome these persisting and existing barriers to achieve gender equality and women's empowerment in climate change processes and in scaling up climate action. So thank you again for taking the time to join us at this event, and I really wish you a very fruitful discussion. Unfortunately, I can't stay with you until the end of the event, but I very much look forward to hearing the outcome and what we're going to bring to COP26 on this important agenda. Thank you. Back to you, Kulthum.
Thank you so much, Mr. Zituni Old Dada. This was a very powerful statement. You touched on a lot of things that we are going to talk about later, and it's unfortunate that you have to go, but we understand, and we'll make sure that we send the outcome of this webinar, make sure you have access to it. But thank you for touching on the issues around empowerment of women, bringing women to the table, and the issue around leaving no one behind. Obviously, that is very important for the FAO. And also thank you for reminding us about how the international processes sometimes have not integrated gender sufficiently, and we'll talk about that when we get to the NAPs. So once again, thank you, Mr. Zituni Dada, and we wish you well if you have to leave now. We're moving on to the next session, which is session 2, where we will now delve deeper in some of the issues that have been raised by our previous speakers, distinguished speakers who spoke before. And we want to talk about the issues around law and policy and legal frameworks. And I remember very well Mr. Zituni talking about this, the importance of laws and policies, and designing policies and laws at the very beginning, ensuring that gender is integrated. So this is important, and we get to discuss that further in this session. This session is organized in such a way that we will begin to understand some of that processes at the multi-level governance. So we'll understand what happens at the international level, national level, sub-national level, and even at the community level. And that's quite key to see how these commitments translate to the local level, and what are some of those challenges that countries experience as you keep going down the governance levels. So our first speaker is Ms. Angie Dace. She's a senior policy advisor and gender equality lead for the NAP, National Adaptation Plan Global Network at ISD. She'll provide us with the global perspective on how these global provisions translate to national level and some of the experiences of African countries in integrating gender into national adaptation plans. Ms. Angie, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I hope you can see my slides. Good morning.
Bonjour tout le monde. Je suis heureux d'avoir l'occasion d'être avec vous pour savoir ce que nous apprenons par rapport au plan NAP. Ce processus a travaillé avec 50 gouvernements pour avoir assisté ces gouvernements.
On how these processes unfold and what the challenges and enablers are. And gender has been a priority theme for the network for the last few years. To begin, I just wanted to give a brief overview of the NAP process for those who may not be familiar with it. This is a strategic process which is most often coordinated by the Ministry of Environment. It aims to integrate climate change adaptation in decision-making across sectors and across levels of governance. As well, it puts in place the systems and the capacities that are needed to make adaptation part of business as usual for governments. And though the process was established before the Paris Agreement, this is a key mechanism for achieving the global goal on adaptation that was agreed in 2015. Many countries are choosing to develop NAP documents, though this isn't technically a requirement. And the important thing to keep in mind is that this is an iterative process. It is more than a document. It's an ongoing cycle of planning, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation. And this process is enabled by a number of factors, and these include financing, institutional arrangements, capacity development, and information sharing. So why should we look at gender in NAP processes? I think we've heard quite a lot about the issues that we're trying to tackle here. Whoops. Sorry. So first, NAP processes are an essential mechanism for advancing adaptation to climate change. They will guide investments in adaptation by governments, the private sector, and development partners over the coming years. What this means is that they represent an opportunity to promote gender equality. On the other hand, gender-responsive approaches are essential for NAP processes to achieve their objectives. There's a human rights imperative that's set out in a number of international agreements, and this is reiterated in key decisions under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. NAP processes won't be effective or sustainable if they don't take gender into account. And lastly, the UNFCCC calls for climate action to be gender responsive, notably in the recently updated Gender Action Plan. So what does it look like when adaptation to climate change is gender responsive? We have identified three main elements. The first is recognition of gender differences in adaptation needs and capacities. So for example, recognizing that women and men play different roles in their households and communities, and that this means their adaptation needs may be different. And I think we heard a number of related issues from our first two speakers this morning. The second element is gender equitable participation and influence in adaptation decision-making processes. So this is about ensuring that everyone has a voice in decisions that affect them, and particularly working to ensure equitable representation of women and people who face discrimination in decision-making processes, including NAP processes. And lastly, a gender-responsive approach involves equitable access to finance and other benefits that result from investments in adaptation. And these three issues require consideration throughout the NAP process, as well as in the enabling activities. At the NAP Global Network, we've been tracking the integration of gender in NAP documents as they're submitted to the UNFCCC. An important thing to note when we're talking about the NAP documents in the context of this conversation is that all countries have identified agriculture as a priority sector for adaptation. So this really represents an opportunity to advance gender-responsive action for resilient food systems. So currently, 23 countries have submitted NAP documents to the UNFCCC, and we expect that quite a few more will come in the lead up to COP26. Among the already submitted documents, 5 are from African countries, including 2 ECOWAS members. So among all of the NAP documents, 96% include references to gender. So basically, there's only one document that doesn't have some reference to gender issues. And among the African NAPs, this is 100%, so they all include a reference to gender. And these references are most often as a guiding principle for the NAP process, or with gender equality identified as an objective for the process. So this is only a starting point, but it's really an interesting and encouraging finding. So all countries are recognizing that gender is an issue to be taken into account when it comes to adaptation. But as I mentioned, NAP processes are much more than documents. So I'm going to share a couple of concrete examples of how countries are taking steps to integrate gender considerations at different points in the process. My first example is Madagascar, where the government completed a gender analysis at the outset of the NAP process to inform the development of the NAP document. This highlighted, for example, the fact that female farmers tend to earn less money and have less access to financial services than their male counterparts, and that this constrains their options in the event of drought. The key issues and recommendations that came out of this analysis were incorporated in the NAP document, which will soon be submitted to the UNFCCC. The second example I wanted to share is from Ethiopia, where a gender analysis was conducted after the NAP document had been developed. The analysis applied a gender lens to all of the actions identified in the NAP and looked at ways to ensure that implementation of the actions is gender responsive. And these recommendations have been integrated in the implementation roadmap for the NAP. So for example, one of the recommendations is to make the agricultural extension service more gender responsive, including by ensuring equitable representation of women among the staff. My third example is from Ghana, where we are working with an organization called Lensational to provide photography and storytelling training to groups of women in an effort to elevate voices that are currently underrepresented in adaptation planning processes. These visual stories will be shared with policymakers, and that will generate dialogue on priorities for adaptation that is inclusive and gender responsive. We've learned a number of lessons through our partnerships with countries, but I'm going to just share 3 key ones here. The first is that gender analysis is an essential foundation for integrating gender in NAP processes. Countries that have completed these analyses are equipped with evidence to inform decision-making. Second, more attention is needed to who is around the table when decisions on adaptation are made. This applies at all levels, from local to international, and across all types of decisions, from planning to budgeting to implementation. And finally, gender expertise exists within most countries. It's just a matter of harnessing it for the NAP process. To close, I was asked to give some thoughts on what parliamentarians can do, and I have a few ideas. First, raise awareness of the importance of integrating gender in climate policies and action. You have a platform that is very important, so please use it to raise awareness around these issues. Second, support budgets for gender responsive planning and implementation of adaptation actions, recognizing that inclusive processes take more time and more resources. And lastly, identify and mentor women leaders, particularly those from underrepresented groups, both within government and among adaptation stakeholders. And I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Angie. That was a very interesting presentation, very insightful. And thank you for showing us this light to the end of the tunnel, that it's not all dark. There are countries that are doing quite a lot. You talk about 96%, so that's quite impressive. And as you say, this is the beginning, and more can be done, but this is a good sign, it's a good signal. And I quite like the fact that you showed us examples of countries starting at different stages. So it doesn't have to be necessarily at the very beginning, or the middle, or somewhere even at the end, but being able to integrate gender at any stage. So it's never too late. And that's an important issue. And thank you for highlighting some of the roles that parliamentarians can take, and highlighting issues around budgeting and how they can support, parliamentarians can support budgets for gender budgets for climate change. And connecting it with what the previous speakers have said, such as bringing voices around the table and empowering women and mentoring women, which is some of the things that were said in our previous discussion. So thank you for that. Let me just remind all the participants that you can pose questions using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your slide, of your screen. Please do that if you want to raise any questions, and we can take that for any of the speakers. We will have a Q&A session at the end of this session too. Our next speaker, and I need to be guided here because I'm not sure if he's in the room, is Honorable Joseph Kamano. Can I get an indication if Honorable Joseph Kamano is in the room? Okay, so it would seem that Honorable Joseph Kamano is not in the room. He is he's a member of the County Assembly in Kenya, Nakuru, and he was going to share some of the experiences of subnational acts, but we will give him some time and maybe organizers can try and catch him. In the meantime, we'll go to the next speaker, who is going to share some national experiences, Mr. Pakum Guru. He is a gender expert with the UNDP in Cote d'Ivoire, and he will share the experiences of how the country has integrated gender into climate policy. Please note that he will be speaking in French, and if you're an English speaker, click the interpretation icon at the bottom for the French translation. Mr. Pakum, you have the floor. Thank you.
Okay.
Allô? Merci, madame.
Thank you, madam. As the moderator said, we would like to share the experience of Cote d'Ivoire in terms of mainstreaming gender in our policies in Cote d'Ivoire. We need to underscore that this process is anchored on the fact that Cote d'Ivoire, through two ministries that are responsible for environment and gender issues, have committed to support and abide by international instruments on the fight against climate change and the fight against gender inequality. And the Sustainable Development Ministry in Cote d'Ivoire has abided by the policies in the fight against climate change at the international level through the ratification of the agreement, Paris Agreement. And this is may compel states, as well as Cote d'Ivoire, of course, it compels states, is binding on states, and at the level of the Women's Affairs Ministry at the government and national level, they are responsible for gender issues. We have the commitment of Cote d'Ivoire to the Beijing Declaration of 1975 and all the supplementary protocols, and CEDAW and all the other legal instruments, and operational structures were put in place, and we have the National Climate Change body that is responsible for climate change in Cote d'Ivoire. It is on the Ministry of Environment, and we have the Gender and Equality Ministry department in my country. And through all the above, the entire process of mobilization of the entire community put in place, and this is how at the level of the UNPCC, we have a unit for gender and social inclusion that will be responsible for mainstreaming gender in terms of climate change, with the appointment of a national focal point, gender and climate change, against climate change. And with these administrative measures, in 2020, we drafted the gender and climate change document, and by 2030, we want to mainstream gender issues in climate policies in our country. And then together with this commitment, we have the Ministry of Women's Affairs that has the framework document with its action plan, and which deals with national gender plan. It was drafted in 2007 and is being reviewed, and the two themes of gender and climate change are cross-cutting, and they deal with development matters. So the UNDP has supported Ministry of Women's Affairs to mainstream gender and issues of climate change in the policy documents that have been reviewed. That is at the strategic level. But how do we support this entire process to give substance to this willingness of my country? We have mobilization of collective action through the establishment of gender and climate change platform within the PNCC that is under the gender and social inclusion team. It brings together all stakeholders on gender and social inclusion to equip them so that we have a pool of experts in this area who would work together to mobilize the entire communities and sectors so that gender and climate change are mainstream in all relevant plans. This platform has worked with collaboration and advocacy documents between the Ministry of Women's Affairs and Environment to boost at the national level and to bring high-level decision makers to give impetus to ensure that we further understand and grasp the difference between men and women and how climate change impacts these two groups. We have had capacity building for private sector, public sector, civil society organization, and media. This collaboration is still continuing, and we have started mobilizing to work in an active manner. We have the support of technical partners and financial partners through the Canadian government that has supported us so that the National Adaptation Plan, the NAP, is responsive to gender issues, gender sensitive. And on the UNDP, we have 3 projects that together with Ministry of Environment are talking about the NAP that is funded by the GCF and UN, EU and GIZ and the Global Fund. These are all under the umbrella of the United Nations or UN Women. This has made it possible for stakeholders to have the capacity to be able to conduct a process that allows them to mobilize the entire community. And now we are conducting advocacy to have an agreement, a memorandum of understanding between Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development and Minister of Women's Affairs in order to carry this out at the level of the government to bring to the fore the concern of incorporating and integrating gender matters in the area of climate change. And the national, the NAP 2020-2025 mainstreams gender issues of climate change. So at the institutional level, this is it has a solid foundation, and with this tool for collective action, which is we have gone to another phase with another mechanism that we have called structured national dialogue revolving around gender and climate change in our national policies. This platform is more extensive than the earlier one, but it takes into account all the sectors, and we were able to mobilize about 60 players at the national level who are working to mainstream all gender issues and climate change matters too. This is the experience of Côte d'Ivoire in terms of mobilization of all the synergies of people who are working on the gender and climate change matters. And with regards to the issue of the question that we have relating to the heading of this meeting in terms of agriculture in the NAP project, we have a study that is ongoing. The study is to assess the potential of women in rural communities in the face of adaptation to climate change. How do we ensure that we take into account the real needs of these women who day in, day out develop strategies for resilience against climate change? This study is ongoing, and we are convinced that the findings of this study would allow us to support the entire policy. Secondly, the CIBT project that deals with climate transparency and deals with greenhouse gas calculations has worked and recruited consultants. And there's a bill on climate change. And in that draft bill, which is before the Minister of Environment, it deals with all matters that are related to other issues relating to climate change, issues of agriculture, gender, take center stage in that bill. And we do hope that with all these that is happening in Côte d'Ivoire, this bill will be tabled at the National Assembly, and we would want to say thank you, because through mobilization of stakeholders, as I said earlier, we have the National Assembly that is participating in our activities, and the Honorable Kwasi Judrik, who's the chair of the female caucus. She is very active, and when we resume the parliamentary session, we will start the advocacy and lobbying to ensure that parliamentarians support us in this, our endeavor on climate change.
Thank you.
That is what I have to say about the commitment of Côte d'Ivoire.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pakum. I was listening on the translation side, so I hope I didn't cut you while you were talking. Thank you for highlighting very important aspects, linking it very well with the previous speaker. I like the fact that you also talk about the gender analysis, which was quite key in informing what these gender challenges are and how those can be incorporated into the bill, but also talking about coordination and how you saw that it was important to have an MOU between the two different ministries so they can work together. So thank you for those lessons. They will be very important when we move forward, and when other countries also want to be able to learn some of the good lessons of Côte d'Ivoire. Any questions? Again, I invite you to put questions on the Q&A. Some of them have already been answered by the previous speakers. So please feel free to do that. I see a hand being raised, but I'll give you the floor after the last speaker for this session. So the last speaker for this session is Ms. Colette Binoji, who is the coordinator of Lead Chat. But unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, she's not able to participate. However, her intervention will be led by Ngabo Daniel. Ngabo Daniel, you have the floor for 7 minutes, please. And if you can make it in 5, that's even better. Please, you have the floor. Do we have Mr. Ngabo Daniel? Daniel Ngabo?
Oui. Oui, je suis avec vous.
Oui, okay.
Vous m'entendez?
Please proceed.
Can you hear me, says Mr. Ngabo? Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you loud and clear. You may take the floor. Thank you. With regards to chat, the experience with regards to gender. What is done at the national level is what the government has adopted a national gender policy, which has been in force since 2017, and it has an application law. And this is the national policy for development 2017-2021 that takes into account the gender issues through the STD 5. With regards to climate and gender, there are two ministries that are involved: the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development and the Ministry of Women Affairs, that pool their efforts to support the activities in terms of gender with the support of technical and financial partners. There are many things that are being done and partners are supporting. And with regards to policies in Chad, the efforts have been put in place, but these efforts have not paid dividend. But when we have the funds, things will progress. And for the operationalization of all that, at the level of our organization, Lead Chad, we have put in place a platform called Agora Trump Resilience, which includes all the entities, the sector ministries, civil society organizations, National Assembly, the members of parliament. There are two people that sit at or attend all the meetings of this platform. At the level of National Assembly, all the advocacy that has been done has led the National Assembly to adopt a law where women should have 30% representation in elective bodies for positions. And the new assembly that has been put in place by the Military Transition Committee out of 73 meant that there are 31 women, and the voices of these women will be pivotal within the assembly. That is an important development. The major problem in Chad, the issue of gender and climate change, is the issue of access to natural resources. That is the problem. Chad is a huge country. If we look at there are major problems. For example, in the Sahel area, efforts have been made to ensure that women have access to natural resources, especially to land and water. These are burning issues in our country because land there's a major case of land degradation. With regards to the policies of the government, we are carrying out many activities to address this problem. And at the same time, LEAD is supporting the government in their national action plans, in the drafting of these plans. And we are validating the country document for gender mainstreaming in national action plan. If this document is validated, it will be distributed and disseminated so that the general public would understand and mainstream gender in the adaptation plan. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Daniel Ngabo, for speaking on behalf of Ms. Colette and highlighting the challenges that women face generally in Chad and issues around natural resources and how challenging that could be for women to access these resources. Thank you for highlighting that. So I'm going to move to the Q&A session and ask if there are any questions from the floor We can take 1 or 2 questions max, and we could let the participants, the speakers, respond to that. I see there were some questions that were raised but have been answered already. If there's anybody who would like to raise some questions right now, please put your hand up or put it in the Q&A. At the moment, I don't see any questions. I can.
Honorable Angelique Ngoma would like to take the floor.
Oh, fantastic. Honorable Angelique Ngoma, please take the floor. You have the floor. Thank you.
J'ai activé. Merci. Je pense que c'est bon.
Thank you. I think you can hear me. Thank you.
We can hear you. Please
for inviting me to this important event.
Il est question d'évoquer des préoccupations.
We are talking about concerns, key concerns related to our environment, to development, sustainable development, I should say, the role and place of women in these developments, especially with regard to the COVID-19 pandemics. Behaviors have changed, and this is why we have to think of the strategies that will focus on their implication and sorting out their concerns. We need to take action in Gabon, and the position of Gabon regarding sustainable development and environment protection is indeed something that we have mainstream, but this requires going with common strategies so that women will not be left aside. What are the concrete actions to be implemented for further actions? What are the means to provide women? Because we have several policies that need to be implemented, especially when they focus on most vulnerable populations. Well, we have to refer to what has been done in terms of actions to fight against environment, climate degradation. These strategies need to be concrete, realistic, and bankable strategies. Very often, we seem to have lost the speaker.
Okay, thank you. We have lost the speaker. So we will continue and let Honorable Angelique Ngoma speak when she's back. I'm not sure if she's back yet. If she's not back, I would like us to proceed, and we'll give her the floor later when she's back online. For now, oh, you're back? Okay, you have 1 minute, Honorable.
Oui, je suis là. Il y a eu peut-être des soucis de connexion.
Yes, I may have had some problems of connection.
La partie visuelle, donc je n'ai que l'audio.
I do not have the visual part, only the audio part.
Mes engagements, parce que parler de changement climatique.
I was talking about climate change, which is assuming that we have strategies, agricultural strategies, because living without agriculture, of course, you have women, 70% of women who are on agriculture, and of course, we have to focus on that. And for them to work properly, it is important for them to work in healthy environment with regard to health and strategies that need to be put in place to avoid having this gap between the North and the South. If we have to fight against epidemics, pandemics, it is appropriate that research and development actions be implemented. For that, as regards COVID-19, this vaccine has to be seen as a universal good. There should be no differentiation as regards its availability between rich countries and poor countries or heavily indebted countries. and especially when you know that it is extremely important for all. So the world will integrate itself. Developed countries, they should help, because highly indebted countries cannot deal with their population. And if there is no population, of course, there will be a real problem. Man being at the center of all concerns, all the appropriate strategies should be put in place by man, for man, and the future of humanity depends on that. The UN Secretary General was saying that yesterday we only thought of a single health crisis, but today this crisis has become a humanity crisis. Because of climate change, we have to be realistic. Each and every one of the concerned states need to take up their responsibilities, especially as regards the polluter pays. Who is going to pay for this or that, or going to assist?
Thank you so much, Honorable
Donc, nous
Ngoma.
pensons que
So we believe that we have to, sorry, the line is very poor. Oh, thank you very much for giving me the floor. And thank you very much for this initiative, for initiating this meeting. As an MP, I'm the chair of the Health, Education, Social and Cultural Affairs at the National Assembly of Gabon. Thank you.
Once again, thank you very much, Honorable Ngoma, and apologies for having interrupting you. We have connectivity problems, and so thank you once again for sharing the experiences and for raising some of those issues that you raised from Gabon, and we'll have an opportunity once the speakers are done to come back on these very issues. So thank you once again. I'm going to put on hold the questions that have been posed for now, and give the floor to the second part of our discussion, which is the multi-stakeholder dialogue. And when we have time, we will take those questions. But I urge panelists to reply to these questions online by typing the responses there. Otherwise, we'll give the floor again to the questions later. But I would like to move on now to the second session, which is the multi-stakeholder dialogue. This is the third and final session that we're having. And this session will look at the voices of the different actors. So we're going to speak to parliamentarians, we're going to speak to governments, we're going to speak to youth, and another parliamentarian as well from the Women's Caucus. So this is going to be very interesting, and I really like to keep this as interactive as possible. If you have any questions, please raise your hand or put them in the chat box. So the first speaker will be Honorable Bathily Kassa, who is a member of parliament from Benin. Honorable Kassa, you have the floor. You have 6 minutes. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Madam. I hope everybody is hearing me. Benin, like many countries, have been hit by the effects of climate change. And I believe that with Benin signing the Paris Agreement 2016, at the national level, we needed to put in place a regulatory legislative framework to try and see how to manage climate change issues, how to mitigate them. And we drafted a law 2018/8 that was adopted 6 August 2018 by the Parliament of Benin. Once this law was adopted, there were provisions in each of the Republic's institutions, that is the government, to ensure that those areas that are impacted by climate change are taken into account in order to efficiently mitigate the effects of climate change. What are those areas when we talk about gender approach? Gender what dimension of gender are we talking about? All the strategies in Benin are based on more or less gender equality to ensure that everybody has equal access to the resources that would help people face up to climate change. When we look at gender, when we say gender, I hear people talk about women. There's also the male gender that is affected when you talk about the youth. All the approaches that we're taking at the national level is not only to support and improve the lot of women, but also the youth, because they are equally vulnerable. We know what the factors of vulnerability are. It is access to resources, access to factors of production, since 80% of the female population and youth are engaged in agriculture in the rural areas, and the main problems, access to land. There's unequal access to land, and there are specific matters that relate to that predicament, and access to inputs, agricultural inputs, access to mechanization of agriculture, because we know that with climate change and its impacts, we cannot continue to work with rudimentary tools like hoes. We need to mechanize agriculture. But when you talk of mechanization, are women and youth, do they have the resources and to access these factors of production, for example, mechanization? There, of course, there was a national plan for adaptation to climate change, which was put in place. And now each sector, each ministry, I should say, and each institution, each decentralized sector, especially in the communities, puts in place appropriate system to ensure that in those sectors, concrete activities and actions are targeted at these vulnerable groups, I mean women and youth. With regards to agriculture, I can mention many projects. There is the intelligent agriculture, smart agriculture against climate change. Smart agriculture, it concerns about 17 major zones in our country. There's also adaptation, for adapted funding for programs that were enforced. The National Fund for Development of Agriculture, namely a program which develops the major plantations. These are a number of initiatives that have been taken in that sector, for which programs have been reviewed to put in place special funding. With regards to each activity, to allow the state to efficiently control initiatives that are reaching, because there's no point saying that we adopt huge documents just to please others. We need to put in place internal monitoring systems. And at the ministry responsible for women's affairs, there was the designation of focal points for each activity sector and for each ministry and for each decentralized sector. And in each ministry, we have a gender focal points who assesses and monitors the policies of its ministry, and which reports at the meeting of focal points, reports on the development and what initiatives have been taken to support, in support of gender equality and climate change. In short, these are the initiatives and the regulatory framework and institutional framework that is put in place in Benin to ensure that our statements are buttressed by actions at the parliamentary level. How do parliamentarians support these initiatives, these measures, this national movement, as it were? It is through the verification of budgeting, of gender-sensitive budgeting. For each budget session, we check for each ministry what programs have been put in place and which are gender-sensitive for adaptation to climate change. And if these programs are not well endowed, we vote more resources for the programs. I like to suggest here that we have support. You know, states do not like the oversight function of parliament, and when parliaments adds funds for its oversight role, it is government grudgingly provides these funds. So it is for this reason that it's important that NGOs are able to support the parliamentarians to have an oversight on the programs that are adopted by the parliament and which are also adopted by the government to support gender and to reverse the adverse effects of climate change. If you don't have that type of independent funding, you cannot report, you cannot adopt measures, and you cannot challenge, and you cannot ensure that what is provided for is implemented. And it will be a matter of policies rather than a matter of implementation of projects. I like to commend our head of state, who has given importance to the National Women's Institute, who would have a role of monitoring all the measures adopted to promote gender equality. And I thank you, Madam.
Thank you very much. I was listening attentively at what you were saying, and all the measures that you've talked about, they resonate very well with this discussion, because you're going into the crux of the matter. What can parliamentarians do? And you talk about how it's important to walk the talk. So it's good enough. It's at the starting point. We have this gender. We talk about gender is important in these areas. But now, how does that translate that into real action? Walk the talk. And I really like that. You also talked about monitoring systems, which is what we haven't heard earlier. And thank you for highlighting the issue around monitoring systems. And you also talked about the role of non-state actors, issues of how to involve NGOs and so on. So this is great, and we think this is for other countries a lot to learn from. At this point, I would like to introduce the next speaker. The next speaker is from government, Dr. Tassila Banda. Dr. Tassila Banda is a coordinator for the Zambia Integrated Forest Landscape with the government of Zambia. Dr. Tassila Banda will talk to us about some of the interventions, how they integrated gender into this project, what are the successes and failures, and what are the role that parliamentarians can take in promoting gender in forest-based integrated landscape management projects. Thank you. Over to you, Tassila.
Thank you, Kothum. May I express my gratitude for inviting me to speak at this meeting. We really appreciate to showcase some of the things that we are doing as we implement these activities on the ground in the communities where we work. The Zambia Integrated Forest Landscape Project is a World Bank financed program which is helping communities to transform the landscape into a low emission economy, a green economy in the sectors of agriculture, forestry, wildlife, and land use planning. I would like to share with you that Zambia has in place a climate change gender action plan, which creates coherent and way of implementation and also stimulates cooperation among different government ministries, departments, programs, agencies, and all stakeholders that are having to do with gender and climate change. The objective of this climate change gender action plan is really to ensure that Zambia's climate change processes and interventions are mainstreaming the gender considerations and are guaranteeing that women and men have, number one, access to, number two, able to participate in, number three, benefit equally from climate change initiatives. So the climate change action plan did on the existing institutional and policy frameworks, particularly the climate change policy, the national climate change policy, and also the national gender policy. So now how does the project like ours, which is a jurisdictional project, covers a large landscape, the size of the Netherlands, for example, in terms of spatial extent. So ZIFIL started out working with different communities, and the main idea is to make sure that there is equal participation in these interventions. So we have a result framework that guides our implementation and also helps us to monitor the activities. And among these, we have indicators that we measure and monitor. The first indicator is on how much space or how much land in terms of hectareage are we covering for climate smart agriculture activities. The second one is how much land are we encouraging sustainable forest management to happen, and we measure that in hectares. The third indicator is where we have to measure the increase in yield of selected crops. We have maize, soybeans, and sunflower by percentage. That is our measure. And the final indicator, the main one, among the four main ones, is how many beneficiaries are we reaching out in these interventions. And the sub-indicator for that, which is very relevant for this meeting that we have today, is that more than 30% of this should be women. So we started implementing in 2018, and with a goal of reaching 30% women. And we are doing at different levels. Of course, there's strengthening of institutions all the way to community level. And it didn't take us long that it will be a while before we get to those numbers that we need, especially at the onset of the project. So we developed a strategy, a project-specific strategy, a gender strategy for the project, so that at least we can bring ourselves into acting on those issues. And this also came with the gender analysis and integration too, which means that for every action and intervention we are making, we have to take into consideration how many women, how many men, and much later we started including youths are being reached out with these activities. So with a project-specific gender strategy, we have seen that it is really helping us to deliver more on our intentions, because we are asserting the roles of women in the communities with regards to participatory land use planning, with regards to sustainable agriculture, with regards to sustainable forest management and wildlife management as well. Number two, we are able to affirm the share of women and men in these sectors that I have talked about where our interventions are. And then finally, we are able to translate the national gender policy into action at community level as we give this climate finance for a low carbon emissions development landscape. So our results so far have been very positive, I have to share, because as I said earlier, we started out wanting to reach 30% of women. We check ourselves, and in 2020, we developed a beneficiary impact assessment where we covered the entire landscape and was able to take into account the ZAMSTATS team, that was doing the pre-census activities. And our results showed us that we've been able to reach in 2020 up to 73% women direct beneficiaries. So there we are very happy. And then at the moment now, even as I speak, the same team of the beneficiary impact assessment, they are in the field to carry out this year's impact assessment, whose results I am very sure we will have at hand by the time we get to COP26 in Glasgow. So you asked about some of these successes. I think we can say 4 things. The biggest success is that we have been able to reach that 75% mark of women beneficiaries participating in all these climate investments. Number 2, our second success is to be able to successfully collaborate with the Ministry of Gender, who had an advanced program where they were targeting nationally women-led cooperatives in agriculture. We reached out to them and we worked together to identify in our jurisdiction where these women-led community groups were. We call them cooperatives here. And we targeted them to help them reach out into our community sub-grant fund for them to build on what they had already started working on with the Ministry of Gender. Because under the Ministry of Gender, they had received basic equipment like tractors, reapers, and that encourage climate smart agriculture. But what about value addition? So what we've seen now is that these women-led cooperatives that have applied have gone into value addition. They have gone into processing. We have, for example, the Sinda Women District Association that is now processing sunflower oil. Sunflower, remember, is one of our crops. We have community groups that are processing peanut butter. Others are packaging, milling and packaging milling meal with a label of their own from their group. So this is improving the livelihoods of the people. It's bringing income to these groups. And as we continue to solidify these activities on the ground, what I didn't share at the beginning is that our program is an emissions reduction program. It means that more people will be conserving these resources and will be able to have emissions reduction that can be purchased at an international scale. The third success story from this is the fact that we've been able to work also with other organizations. For example, on the wildlife sector, there's Frankfurt Zoological Society. There's also the Integrated Land and Resource Governance, who have been supporting with us collectively the National Community Resource Board Association. Community resource boards are part of our recipients, especially on the sub-grant side, and also on the side of human-wildlife conflict management. And they have been applying for grants from us. But with the effort that was made, there's a tool that is used called the Governance Management Effective Tracking Tool. This is able to be applied, especially we saw it being applied during the time that the community resource boards were being formed and the elections are going to happen. They were encouraging women to participate more into this level of conservation work. And last but not least, I also want to include that it's not just women, it's also the youth. What we've seen is that as we are doing agroforestry activities, most of the participants that have helped us, for example, in the last season, we raised 2.5 million seedlings of Glycidia and Fidebia to be planted in our lead farmers' fields. Most of the labor force that came to help the farmer training centers to raise these millions of seedlings were youths. And we are also encouraging youth groups to apply for sub-grants as well in our landscape. So in terms of recommendations, I think most of them have already been shared by previous speakers. I think where countries don't have the national strategies, national policies on gender, if a program is happening at implementation level like ours, we would recommend that they also develop a project-specific gender strategy for themselves, and the tools that come with it, so that they can be able to reach the numbers in terms of the balance of men and women participating. The second recommendation is working with existing structures. I think we are used to working in silos, But if you work with an existing infrastructure, like the way we did with the gender advanced program, we were able to achieve much more beyond the 30% of women being reached. And then the last one, I think multiple speakers have talked about deliberate gender budgeting. That cannot be overstated. So I think I end there with the recommendations, Kotun. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tassila. Thank you for that, and thank you also for ending with recommendations. And Tassila, you didn't tell us that you're one of the participants that are in this program of FAO that is supporting and empowering female negotiators for climate change. So
yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. It's really a great honor to have been among the 6 female negotiators for the Joint Colonivia program. So I'm very grateful and honored to be among those. Thank you.
Thank you so much for letting us know that you're one of the recipients of that program that was talked about by a keynote speaker. And for highlighting some of those very powerful recommendations. And again, I like that we're able to connect the dots from some of the recommendations that came earlier, and we're seeing a common thread that's running across all of these recommendations. You know, the recommendations around youth, you know, involvement of women and youth, and not just women. The recommendations around gender analysis, how that is a very powerful tool to inform your policies and decision making, as well as if you're going to develop a gender specific strategy, which came very strongly from Dr. Tassila Banda, and a lot of other recommendations. And I really like the last one that you gave, working with existing structures, that you're more successful when you work with existing structures because there's already the foundation within which you can build. So thank you for those recommendations. We're taking good notes, and we hope to come out with some good recommendations out of this meeting, out of this webinar that we can share with the rest of the world. So youth has been talked about a lot. And our next speaker, I'm so proud to introduce Ms. Nazreen Islam. Ms. Nazreen, I also know her personally in the negotiation space. And this is why one of the people that I think would need to speak about this thing, about the topic of today. She is a member of the youth constituency. She belongs to UNGO, which is a youth constituency of the UNFCCC, but she was recently chosen to chair the UN Secretary General Youth Advisor on Climate Change, along with 6 other climate activists. So we're very happy to have you at least to speak about some of the issues that were raised, but also the youth issues came out quite a lot. So Ms. Nazreen, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for hosting me, first of all, and thank you very much for this very intensive and very fruitful discussion. I enjoyed every bit of it. As mentioned, I'm Nazreen Al-Saim. I am from Sudan, and I will first of all speak a little bit about the Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change. So in 2019, September, we had the first ever Youth Climate Summit in New York, just before the Climate Action Summit. And in the Youth Climate Summit, young people requested from the Secretary General to have like an open window with him. So we came as the bridge between the Secretary General of the UN and young people around the world. As mentioned, also we are 6, actually we are 7, and 6 others than me, representing all of the different continents and different regions of the world with different age and different backgrounds. Also, we have an economist from Moldova representing Eastern Europe. We have a policy supervisor from France representing Western Europe. We have lawyer Paloma from Brazil representing Latin America, and I am representing Africa. And also we have Archana, she's a researcher representing India, the Asian continent. And we have Ernest, he's a communication officer, and he's representing also the Pacific and the small island states. So now today I am in Milan attending the Youth for Climate Summit just before the pre-COP, and in this summit young people from different countries of the world, around more than 400 participants, 2 from each country, are here actually to represent their hopes and aspirations, and what do you think in general, and what we have recommendations for COP26, and how can we actually drive the ambition, because this is the title of the event, which is Youth Driving Ambition, and how can we drive the ambition when it comes to different articles. Luckily, we have some sort of a gender balance here, and young ladies and young climate activists actually are very much on fire, let me say. And we have a very nice diversity of backgrounds also and ages. There's a lot of underage participants, age of 16, 17, and also 15. So I think the next generation, the other young people, the younger than us, are really coming very hard on the climate movement and the climate action. It's very much linked to the topic of today, which is gender and climate change and food security and other things. Italy is also hosting the Food Summit, which is a very long process that had led to a very fruitful participation from young people also when it comes to sustainable consumption, when it comes to recycling, reduce and reuse also of the food, and what kind of the system we want. And I know it's one of the high-level summits happening on the side of the General Assembly, but the pre-summit was here in Italy. Actually, there's a lot of things happening at the same time. And this means there's a lot of momentum, but all of what's happening right now is leading to one direction, that we need urgent climate action to tackle different issues. Well, unfortunately, as a young person, I can say that we get double discrimination as young females. We get discrimination because of our gender, but also because of our age. Ageism, as they call it, is a huge issue right now. Although everyone is talking about young people and everyone is so happy and proud of young people, when it comes to actual implementations and actions, this happiness, this proudness, these smiles faint away, and we only left with very nice speeches and shaking hands. Well, young people, just like climate action, needs a push, needs an action. We need capacity building. We need to be involved in the policy making, in the policy designing and implementation of it on the local level, on the national level, but also in the multilateral level. As a junior negotiator with the African Group of Negotiators, I've been very privileged to have this experience on learning on the ground with the very amazing negotiators of the African Group. I did not do Kurnovia, I did gender, I did capacity building, I did action for climate empowerment, and currently I'm dealing with technology transfer. And I'm not as young as I look because some people was like, when did you do all of this? But well, it's actually I've been in the field for climate change now almost 10 years. It's 10 years 2022, and I've seen how young people pushed things and accelerated the movement and accelerated the actions from the previous time that we had, and the slow movement and the slow change. Well, I am in the category of non-state actors, and well, it's actually a joint work between states and non-states, because some work is actually mandated by government and it's not up to the civil society to do it, but a lot of work when it comes to the local communities, the grassroots communities, the most vulnerable communities, is also up to the civil society, to the youth movement to help them. How can we help the youth movement? Flow of finance, very efficient partnerships, very acknowledging their work by actually giving them more space and more acknowledgement based on their professionalism, not only based on their how old are they, but also based on their professional and their expertise and their knowledge that they have. And I say partnership and flow of finance because I'm also co-chairing, chairing the Sudan Youth Organization on Climate Change, which is our local platform in Sudan. And I can tell you it's so hard to have access to funding for small organizations and youth-led organizations. But sometimes we seek partnerships with different organizations and older organizations also, but also UN agencies. Such a partnership can allow young people to do actions without even having financial flow. And this will help a lot to reduce the issues of accountability and financial audit and all of these nitty-gritty details, because honestly, our communities cannot wait for these details, and climate action also cannot wait. Now we had more than 6 reports since the last COP. All of them are saying that we are dangerously heading to irreversible climate impacts and climate crises. In Sudan, last year, we had the worst flood in 100 years. More than 800,000 were homeless. We lost 7 lives, and we also more than 500,000 were actually lost their livelihood because they are either farmers or pastorers, and their farms and their pastoral were carried away by the floods. And climate crisis is a huge threat to food security, especially for very vulnerable communities like Sudanese community, because we depend 70% on rain-fed agriculture, and we know how climate change have a big sensitivity with the rain-fed. So either a lot of water or a very little water. Last year was the year of flood, but this year is the year of drought. Unfortunately, more than 6 African countries announced drought, and more are coming, unfortunately. So it's time for action. It's time to lose the bureaucracy, because bureaucracy will not save our lives, will not save our communities, and it's time for more meaningful inclusion and engagement of young people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nazreen. You know, whenever you talk, I get goosebumps. You know, I am so happy to hear, you know, such powerful voices, and it gives me comfort that, you know, the future is really bright, as we keep saying, but now we actually see it. And as you say, the youth and the advocacy and the movement is getting, is coming from younger and younger people. So this is quite comforting. And you said something that really stuck with me around beyond the rhetoric. We mention youth a lot. You say that, we talk about youth all the time, but moving from that to action. So beyond the rhetoric, how are we really addressing issues of youth? So thank you for highlighting that. And I learned a new word, ageism. I have noted that as a new word that I'm learning. So thank you for highlighting that. And we'll come back to you with questions when time allows. So thank you again, Ms. Nazreen. The last speaker is, we have an honorable member of parliament from Côte d'Ivoire. I'm not sure if we have her in the room, Honorable Kwasi Marie-Virginie. She is the chair of the Parliamentary Women's Caucus in Côte d'Ivoire. Honorable, are you in the room? Are you in the room?
Désolé, Kwasi Marie-Virginie n'a pas pu se connecter. Donc, avec des soucis pour la connexion, je me propose peut-être de partager avec vous peut-être un certain nombre de choses, puisqu'on a échangé sur les perspectives de collaboration entre
discussions on the caucus of women parliamentarians and the platform in order to promote gender and climate change issues. The draft bill, this connection is really
Mr.
poor.
Pakum, we are not able to hear you very clearly, and we are left with content. We can't hear you. We're struggling to hear you. So,
c'est bon, vous m'entendez maintenant?
Mr. Pakum, we will.
He's asking if we can hear him now.
Yes, but the connection is very bad. Can I ask that we take questions from you? If the honorable member is not here, we will take questions. We will direct questions to you because we are only left with 10 minutes. So let me go over to the next session, which is the Q&A, and come to you if there are questions directed at you. Thank you. With regards to questions, I don't see any other questions except for one question. I hope you've heard me, Mr. Pakum. Okay, we'll move to the next session, which is the Q&A, and I urge you to raise any questions that you have to the previous speakers. And we'll go to, I have one question that is in the chat box. It's from Rose Hogan, and I hope she is still in the room. It says, while the main model of agriculture promoted by governments is neither environmentally nor women nor NAP sensitive, can there be progress? Many governments continue to subsidize monocultures of high demand staples and the large companies which squeeze smallholders, while women have diverse agendas for the use of land and resources, including provision of diverse diets, energy, as well as cash-making opportunities. The agricultural policies and strategies need to be analyzed as to their gender, ecological, and climate sensitivity. How would Parliament ensure that this analysis takes place and that agricultural policies are transformed? I would like to invite a member of Parliament, Honorable Kasa. Would you like to take this question, please? Thank you.
Allô? Je n'ai pas bien suivi, madame, ce que vous me demandiez de faire.
What are you asking me to do, madame? Madame, what did you want me to do?
How will parliamentarians ensure that this analysis of gender... We seem to be having a connection problem. Can I get from the team what is the problem now? We seem to be getting some connection problems. Okay, can you hear me, Honorable Kasa?
Oui, j'entends maintenant, j'entends.
Okay, great. Mr.
Yes,
Pakum,
I can hear.
Okay. The question reads, how will parliamentarians ensure that this analysis takes place and that agriculture policies are transformed? Okay, we seem to be having some technical challenges.
Yes, somebody.
Looking out to the technical team to let us know if there's a solution to this. There seems to be a problem with our translation. Yes, there is a problem, and we apologize for that. Well, if there are no further questions, we're left with 7 minutes. I can take one more question, but we seem to be having problems with.
Je n'ai pas encore répondu, je n'ai pas entendu la question, je n'ai pas répondu.
May I suggest you try with me? Can you try with Ms. Motsumi? Can you try with me?
It's not a problem of transmission, but we don't understand.
Hello.
It's a technical problem, I think.
Can you repeat the question, please? Can you repeat the question so that I can?
Translation to stop translating for this one because there seems to be a problem with the translation. So the question comes, and it comes from a person by the name of Rose Hogan. She's asking how many governments continue to subsidize monocultures of high demand, large companies squeeze smallholders, women are basically suffering because of no land and no resources. How can parliamentarians ensure that this analysis takes place, that agricultural policies are transformed? How can parliamentarians ensure that agricultural policies are transformed to the benefit of women? Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Je pense que j'avais déjà effleuré la réalité.
Thank you very much. I can say that in many countries, the executive and the legislative are separate bodies, but in the case of Benin, and I think this applies to all, the parliamentarian has control power, has power to control government action, which means that all initiatives which are programmed by the government may be, say, audited, yes, audited by parliamentarians or verified by parliamentarians. And this parliamentarian control, when that is it, parliamentarians are very careful. And that is why I think that if there are programs in the agri field, it is important that on a periodic basis, the various parliamentarians be able to assess these programs. That is why I'm saying that governments are very reluctant to fund the control or control action. Since they are reluctant, it is important that parliaments establish within themselves groups or establish groups, how should I call them? Committees, yes, who are dedicated to controlling government action in this regard. We can call them control group or committee control, or control committee rather, committees controlling gender-related issues after the various programs or budgets adopted. These parliamentarians will see what are the programs which are funded by the national budget. These programs, are they monitored by the parliamentarians who will be looking for external resources? Because if it is internal resources, they will not be provided. That's all. This is how to, what I can say regarding how parliamentarians can take into account this concern, which does necessarily call for deep changes for gender. Otherwise, this will be just statement. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those very clear recommendations on how parliamentarians can ensure that we address the gender issues within agricultural transformation. And I would like to give the floor to the last intervention. This is Honorable Angelique Ngoma. Angelique, Honorable, you have the floor for the last 2 minutes. 1 minute, 1 minute, please, and then we'll close.
Oui, je vous remercie.
I thank you. I simply want to address the input from our three colleagues, especially that from Honorable Kassa, who talked about missions to assess public policies. And this indeed should be the responsibilities of MPs for them to make sure that within the framework of budget program voted by national assemblies, focusing on gender, there is a genuine reflection on the field. We have followed Mrs. Tassila Banda in the framework of her assistance program, which enabled to make sure that the FAO supports negotiators for climate change. I think this aspect regarding parliamentarian assistance, the structure put in place with the support of FAO could be good, so that we are able to take advantage of this assistance for effective action to the benefit of women. And we talked about youth. Of course, beyond intentions, it is important to move to action. It is true that it is good to have standards, because without standards, you cannot evolve in our societies, but it is important to see things implemented on the field. The youth being the future of, being the asset of future, it is important to focus on that, but the basis is training, transfer of technologies, assistance. Sometimes these climate change issues are to be connected with design issues, and it is important that we have right action. Thank you for giving me the floor.
Thank you very much, Honorable. And indeed, you gave the final comments, which brings everything together. And before we close, which, by the way, I'm going to ask Dr. Ernest Aube, who was speaking on behalf of the ECOWAS Commissioner, to close in 2 minutes. I would just like to take this opportunity just to highlight some of the issues that we've heard today and some of the very strong recommendations that have come from today's discussion. And I have a couple, and I would like to share those with you. The first is, we heard a lot about the importance of having a gender analysis, so using the gender tools that are available, to be able for us to make more informed decision making. So understand what those gender constraints are, and in some cases, like we heard from Tassila, Dr. Tassila Banda, how that then informed a project-specific gender strategy. Without understanding where the gender issues are, you cannot develop strategies and interventions to address them. There was the other issue around collaboration between the ministries of environmental climate change, whatever it may be, with the Ministry of Gender. And we saw that even in Cote d'Ivoire, there was even an MOU, but it came out strongly how we can't continue to work in silos if we're going to address or try to address the issues around gender. The issue of women and youth came out, and Nazreen talked a lot about that, but she also highlighted the issue of ageism. I really like that word, ageism, and how we need to move beyond the rhetoric and give spaces and provide platforms and funds for youth-based, particularly youth-based and women organization. So that kind of double tragedy that she talked about. And then some of the speakers talked about working within existing structures and how that yielded more positive benefits to achieve more of your target of what you want to achieve when it comes to gender. We had a lot of that from Tassila. We also heard at the very beginning the issue around to empower. Who is around the table? Who is going to be around the table and the negotiation table, on the developing table, whatever you're developing, whatever you're working on, decision-making table, who is around there, providing spaces for different voices, including voices of women. So that issue around empowerment and having the right people around the table is important. And finally, the issue of it's never too late. It's never too late to start the process. I think we heard that a lot from Angie, who talked about how it can start at the very beginning, middle, as long as it starts. And sometimes it can start with just an aspiration. Sometimes it can be very concrete in an action plan. Sometimes it can be more detailed, and the budgeting that allows you to actually do gender work within agricultural transformations. So those are some of the key issues that I've heard today, and I'm glad that we'll be able to bring all of these together and put it in a recommendation that we can then send out to everybody that has come to this meeting, to this webinar. And once again, thank you very much for this very active participation. I'm not closing the meeting. The meeting will be closed by Dr. Aube, who will have the floor, but just to say that the recording of this will be available as well on the website that we will send to you as well. And the report of the meeting will also be available on the website. Thank you very much. And I'll hand over to Dr. Aube to close the meeting. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I hope you are hearing me. Are you hearing me?
We can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, thank you very much. On behalf of the Commissioner of Agriculture, Mr. Sekou Sangere, I want to thank everybody who participated in this 6th webinar. A lot of useful recommendations have been made, issues raised. We all should come together to ensure that we implement these recommendations. I want to thank the International Institute for Sustainable Development, parliamentarians, and all stakeholders for sparing their time to join this important webinar. I wish you every success, and we hope to meet again in the 7th webinar in due course. I formally declare this 6th webinar closed. God bless you all, and thank you very much.